Hello and good evening. My name is Dr. Brian Henning. I am Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies and Sciences at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, where I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the Gonzaga Institute for Climate, Water, and the Environment. It's my pleasure to have you here tonight for our lecture on divestment as mission fidelity. Before I go too much further, I wanted to also share with you that our last event of the lecture series this semester will be held on Monday, April 20th. So a week from today, we'll have an event on AI, climate change, and energy demand with a really excellent panel that'll be hosted in the Hemmingson Center ballroom if you're local or online streaming. And so make sure you're registered for that event. Go to gonzaga.edu/climate events to be able to learn more about that wonderful event, the last of our lecture series this semester. As you can imagine, hosting these events and doing the work that we do in and for the community requires quite a few resources. And so if you believe in our work and have resources to share, please consider going to gonzaga.edu/climate giving or scan the QR on your screen and send us a little bit of money to help us to continue to expand what we do. We really appreciate it. Our event tonight on divestment as mission fidelity, Catholic fossil fuel divestment, is co-sponsored by Gonzaga University's Mission Office of Mission Integration, and we're really proud to co-sponsor this event with them. Obviously, this event and this issue, in our opinion, is central to our work and to our identity as a Catholic Jesuit humanistic university. Before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to mention a little bit of the context at Gonzaga for this issue. It's been since the 2015-2016 academic year that there has been an active student effort in order to try and persuade our Board of Trustees to divest our endowment from fossil fuels. As many of you know, we have resources that people send us. It's like a big savings account. They call it an endowment, and the university takes a portion of that and invests in different things in order to be able to try and bring a return to make it possible for us to do student scholarships and to pay for the work of the university. The students' view is that the university should figure out a way to commit to divesting from fossil fuels, that we should stop trying to profit from the sale of the very things that are causing catastrophic climate change. It's pretty remarkable that this has been going on now for more than 10 years. It's hard for student-led projects to last this long because students have a way of continuing to graduate. And this is now at least the fourth generation of students who have been advocating for this. As you can see on your screen, they've been quite busy, although not yet successful. They remain undeterred. So with that, I am very happy to introduce our speakers for tonight. Dr. Dan DiLeo is Associate Professor and Director of Justice and Peace Studies program at Creighton University. He specializes in Catholic social teaching and climate change with a focus on Pope Francis's Laudato Si and Laudate Deum. In 2022, he co-authored the Catholic Theological Society of America, or CTSA's, Ad Hoc Fossil Fuel Divestment Review Committee report, and chaired the Climate Justice Committee that enacted the CTSA's divestment commitment. He is also a member of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities Laudato Si Commission and authored recommendations of how schools can take climate action aligned with their Catholic Jesuit mission. Since 2009, Dr. DiLeo has served as consultant with Catholic Climate Covenant, of which the U.S. Conference of Bishops is a founding member. He earned his PhD and master's in theological studies from Boston College and his BA in sociology from Cornell. Join me in welcoming Dr. DiLeo. And secondly, we have Dr. Erin Lothes. She's the executive director of the Bethany Center Hudson Valley, an ecological education center in New York. She is author of Inspired Sustainability, Planting Seeds for Action, and The Paradox of Christian Sacrifice, The Loss of Self, The Gift of Self, as well as many articles on faith-based environmentalism and energy ethics, and a commentary for the Orbis Books publication of Pope Francis's Laudate Deum. Dr. Lothes was a tenured associate professor of theology at St. Elizabeth's University until she resigned to lead the Laudato Si Animators program with the Laudato Si movement. She's been a longtime collaborator and divestment activist with many interfaith and environmental coalitions, such as Green Faith, the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale, and the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. where she presently is a visiting scholar. She's also ecclesial affiliate with the Laudato Si Research Institute, Campion Hall at Oxford University. Join me in welcoming Dr. Erin Lothes. Welcome, Dan. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henning. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today and to join the Institute for Climate, Water, and Environment at Gonzaga. I have been a long time admirer of the outstanding programs you conduct, the excellent conversations. So it's really a privilege and an honor to be part of this conversation tonight on a very critical topic. And it's great to be joined by my longtime colleague, Dr. DiLeo, as well.
But I'll hand it off to you two. Take it away.
Very well. So let me begin by talking about why divestment is a question for Catholic institutions. What are the theological foundations of fossil fuel divestment, and what are some of the misperceptions about this commitment? So first of all, in many ways, we have to begin with those convictions in our faith that lead us to everything we do that is most important to our hopes for the future. And so for many of us, we feel that knowing what the world may soon look like is a call to continue to steward this beautiful earth that God has given us, recognizing that we have not created this earth. It's been given to us so that its gifts can be meant for all. Part of my story is my hopes for the future generations. You would think this is my child. This is not. This is my younger sister. But many of us have children who are quite young. I have teenagers. We look ahead to future generations. Every university is a fiduciary for college-age students and will always continue to be. It is the role of universities to protect young people and guide and protect their futures. The woman on the other part of the screen is my great-great aunt, who was a sister in the same religious congregation as Sister Dorothy Stang, who was a martyr for the environment, a martyr for the Amazon. Why? Because these areas have been threatened. So what we know is that it's not a matter of debate, and I'm not going to raise those scientific points. We are seeing a climate crisis and need to address it. Where I first became aware of it is in the heat and the pollution in New York City and in the refineries along the New Jersey highways, which many of you may be familiar with these sites. I early, well, maybe not so early, became aware that people would be disrupted by climate change, that they would be dislocated from their homes, that hunger and suffering would be increased. And so this is an image of refugees experiencing violence. And this is one of the earliest slides that I started sharing in presentations as long ago as 2012. And I haven't changed it. We've just seen the reality of climate refugees intensify. So the theological foundations, why do we care, go to the great command that Jesus taught us. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And as Pope Francis says, love the earth as part of loving your neighbor. The way we must love our neighbor in this world today is to care for the ecological systems that are embedded in the neighbor's lifestyle, livelihood, security, and well-being. And so because energy decisions impact people's well-being, health, security, livelihood, and even in many cases, capacity to live and survive disasters. energy decisions are ethical decisions. We cannot escape this fact. That is the first principle of energy ethics. Energy decisions are ethical decisions. How does that lead me to divestment? Well, in 2014, I came across this complicated graph. And what it tells you in a nutshell is if we just look at this side of the screen with more of the black and yellow, you can see that this is a set of 6 models of energy. 6 different group of scientists and engineers got together and said, how much of each different energy source will we need that is actually not ambitious enough to stay only at a 2% increase in the temperature? And they predicted different ways depending on what they anticipated energy would, how it would evolve. This group over here were tasked with another metric, another horizon, and that is what mix of energy sources would we need to have a 70% probability of stopping at 2% temperature increase. So to have a 70% probability of stopping at 2%, we would need this group of energies. And as you can see, it is intensely more steeped in the green energies, biomass, and other renewables. We need a massive increase in renewables to have a 70% probability of a 2% increase. A 2% increase is intolerable. We are already seeing over 1.5, what was the Paris commitment. And we are already seeing the impacts of that. And that's a 70% chance. So for us to get to the energy infrastructure that delivers us a safe energy mix is going to require dialing down radically from our current fossil fuel mix. I say this every time I look at this graph. If you were told that the plane you're about to board has a 70% chance of landing safely, would you get on that plane? No, not get on that plane. And that's the plane that we're on. So we need to make a huge shift. And there's only one way to do that. If we want apples, we have to stop planting orange plantations and investing in the manufacture of orange seeds. And at the same time, this has to be done in a nonpartisan way, which I'll speak to later. So I just want to conclude this discussion of theological foundations and misperception is that there's been a narrow perception of the fiduciary as strictly monetary, overlooking the social nature of the person in Catholic theological anthropology and Catholic social teaching. We understand that the person is rooted in a society. And so the decisions made have to benefit not just a narrow monetary bottom line, but the society as a whole. There's often a misperception that that divesting will cause an organization to lose money. This is not necessarily true, but at the same time, ethically, it's irrelevant. We have other morality-based screens that do not take profit into consideration. And I would say the last misperception that's pretty operative, very influential, is that if we divest, we lose the opportunity to raise our voices in the public square through shareholder engagement. And that's not the case either. We can do both. We can divest all of our money except the $2,000 needed to continue with shareholder engagement, divest the rest, and keep on with whatever shareholder engagement is of value to the community. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. DiLeo.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Brian, for hosting. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and I think this is of interest to lots of people, both in universities, but more broadly across the church. So, as Brian said, I'm a moral theologian, and so the theological foundations that I want to briefly sketch out are from the Catholic tradition with respect to moral decision making. And we can frame this in lots of different ways, but I want to begin by setting the stage, defining things in the positive. Um, we are loved by a God who is love, and who in turn calls us to love self, neighbor, and creation. And when we talk about love, we have to be very, I think, precise about our terms. In the Catholic tradition from St. Thomas Aquinas, love is to will and to act for the good. So love is a verb. Love is not just sentimental, affective. Love is active. When we think about what kind of action love requires, the US bishops identify both the 2 feet of charitable works and social justice. How do we act for the good? We act for the good in one way through charitable works, which is direct interpersonal service. So going and serving a meal to a person experiencing homelessness. And that's necessary, but in the Catholic tradition, that alone is insufficient because the Catholic tradition emphasizes the concurrent need for social justice. And social justice reforms systems and structures and policies. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but in terms of love, it's both and from a Catholic perspective. When we talk about love, we can hopefully begin to think more critically about what is faith. Faith in the Catholic tradition is defined in the Catechism as an adequate response to God's love. And I think that word adequate is so important because it speaks to a couple of things. Number one, it speaks to faith as a virtue needing to be informed by the moral virtue of prudence. Prudence is right reason in action. So faith requires action that's guided by the best available information. In this case, the information about climate science. When we talk about love, we can also then define sin as the obverse. Sin, most basically, is a failure to love. And when we talk about sin in the Catholic tradition, we can talk about this failure in 2 different ways. We can talk about sins of commission. This is doing something unloving proactively. We can also, though, talk about sins of omission, not doing something loving that one could or should do. So it's a failure to take some kind of action. When we think about sin, we tend to think about it in personal dimensions, and that's true. But as the Catholic tradition emphasizes, sins give rise to social situations and institutions that are contrary to the divine goodness. Structures of sin are the expression and effect of personal sins. They lead their victims to do evil in their turn. In an analogous sense, they constitute a social sin. If social justice is love at the macro level, social sin is a failure to love at the macro level, both by commission through unloving policies, but also through an unwillingness to enact loving policies. And just like we talk about social justice in society, we can also talk about social justice within institutions, within organizations. So organizations like universities have internal policies that constitute a form of social justice. We can also then talk about social sin in both society and in the church. The church failing to faithfully develop and implement adequate responses in the form of institutional policies is arguably a social sin. It's an ecclesial sin. And this is a matter of faith, of fidelity, but the Catholic tradition also recognizes that it's a matter of credibility. So the World Synod of Bishops in the document Justitia in Mundo writes that the church is obliged to live and administer its own goods, so goods like money, goods like energy, in such a way that the gospel is proclaimed to the poor. If instead the church appears to be among the rich and powerful of this world, its credibility is diminished. If we are calling people to do something, but we ourselves have an opportunity to do it, and by omission choose not to, that diminishes the church's credibility, both in terms of dioceses and parishes, but also arguably in terms of Catholic institutions like universities. And digging even more into the theology, we can begin to think about this as the potential for scandal. So scandal in the Catholic tradition, formally defined in the Catechism, as an attitude or behavior which leads another to do evil. In terms of social sin, scandal sets up policies or omits policies that cause people to act in ways that compromise the good. In this case, to continue the use of fossil fuels, to continue to invest in and profit from unjust practices. And the tradition also recognizes that scandal takes on a particular gravity by reason of the authority of those who cause it. In other words, those who have more power and authority to enact policies and by omission choose not to are arguably more culpable for social sins of omission. So the Catholic tradition really gives us a rich moral framework to begin to think about divestment and the ethics of divestment. And when we think about the ethics of divestment, I think it's important to follow up on what Erin described in terms of misperceptions, because we can think about the theology in general terms, but when we start to apply it in the context of climate, in my experience working for 15 years now on this topic in particular, there are some misperceptions that can really be fatal to divestment. The first has to do with papal precedent. There's a sense in my experience that concern about climate change started with Pope Francis. This started in 2015. This started with Laudato Si. In my experience, if that's the perception, then Pope Francis and his calls for climate justice can be dismissed because they're new, they're unorthodox, and they're radical. The fact is that Francis was echoing papal precedent going all the way back to 1990 and St. John Paul II's World Day of Peace message. As you can see, he emphasized the greenhouse effect has now reached crisis proportions as a consequence of industrial growth, massive urban concentrations, and vastly increased energy needs. So 35 years ago, St. John Paul II is using crisis language to describe climate change, greenhouse gases, and energy. So Francis is not doing something new that can be in any way framed as dismissible by virtue of its being new or radical. The second misperception is a sense that in terms of energy choices and investment policy, it's sufficient to say it's just business. This captures a kind of neoliberalism that says we can and should only be concerned about economic profit. Morality is for other spheres of life. That is wholly inconsistent with the Catholic understanding of economics. Erin alluded to this, but as Pope Benedict XVI described in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, economic activity is always concerned with humans and their needs. Locating resources, financing, production, consumption, and all the other phases in the economic cycle inevitably have moral implications. For better or for worse, how we use money promotes the good of persons or it undermines the good of persons. It protects human dignity or it violates human dignity. And so thus Benedict went on and said, every economic decision has a moral consequence. It's never just business, and that includes investments, both personal, but also institutional. The third misperception follows this, and it's a sense that we can and should pursue what Benedict the next year described as myopic economic interests. So in his 2010 World Day of Peace message, Benedict XVI wrote, "It's not hard to see that environmental degradation is often due to the lack of far-sighted official policies or to the pursuit of myopic economic interests, which then tragically become a serious threat to creation. We should only invest in holdings, companies, securities, annuities that are going to maximize our short-term immediate profit. Whatever it does to people and planet, we should only be concerned with economic return." He went on and said, when making use of natural resources, we should be concerned for their protection and consider the cost entailed environmentally and socially as an essential part of the overall expenses incurred. You may have heard something like ESG investing, ESG economics, that think about environment, that think about social, that think about governance. Benedict is saying, because all economics is moral, we have to be concerned with social and environmental costs of both action, but also inaction. What's going to be the cost to people and planet if we choose not to do this by omission? So there's a cost benefit to the ledger in terms of both acting and choosing not to act. And this insight described, I think, is really well in Vatican's Laudato Si. So hopefully folks are familiar with this resource from the pastor for promoting human development. But this seeks to equip and empower 7 different sectors of the Catholic Church, of which one is educational institutions, you can see. to live Laudato Si. And the goal is to live Laudato Si by pursuing 7 different aspirations. The third, listed here in the top right, is ecological economics. And ecological economics recommends and includes activities like divestment from fossil fuels. So the Vatican's resource is essentially setting up a platform by which Catholic institutions, including universities, can practically live church teaching on economics generally, but also environmental justice in particular when it comes to thinking about the morality of its investment. So we've got lots to talk about. This is our foundation and our misperception correction. Erin and I have been working on this for several years, and one of the things that we're both proudest of is our work with the Catholic Theological Society of America, the CTSA. And so I'll turn it back over to Erin to share a bit about our work and how CTSA ultimately discerned and elected to divest.
Thank you very much, Dan. Indeed, it was a great process working together with you and with our friends and colleagues in the CTSA, and a great learning experience. And I'll say that I learned tremendously in the process of discussing, advocating for, and sharing information with the CTSA in order to support a divestment decision for all the reasons we've mentioned, for all the reasons that if we want apples in a clean energy economy, we have to stop building orange plantations. It's just very simple. So I'd like to make my points under the headers of process, people, and persistence. The process that you will face if you are advocating for divestment may vary given the context that you are in. Maybe there are governance institutions or layers of government. Maybe there are representative bodies that are charged with gathering information. Maybe it's very flat organization. It's simply like a Vermont town hall, one person, one vote. So understanding the process is very important, and being diplomatic. One of the worst mistakes we could have done at the beginning of the process was to simply call for a vote at the first business meeting. Everyone in favor of divestment? We probably would have said, I don't understand this. What's it about? Why do we need to do this? What does this have to the CTA say? Yeah, I don't think so. And then we would have had a nay vote and the issue is over. So it's important not to jump the gun, understand the process, and be diplomatic about it. And so this takes us to people. And the important part here about people is understanding the different perspectives. And we've all come to respect and honor this process so much more as synodal listening has become a part of our church. And thank God for that. So understand the perspectives of people involved. And this, I believe, is a spiritual process. It's a difficult process for people who are passionately committed to care for creation and passionately committed to care for their common home, and wanting to see actions that are very necessary. Being calm and diplomatic can be quite difficult. So that's why I think it's a spiritual process. It is, I would even go so far as to say it's a kenotic process. It is a self-emptying process where we put aside what we know and value as so important, moving our society out of dependence on fossil fuels, and even more directly, ending the completely unnecessary process of investing for further prospecting. We don't need to look for any more. There's plenty already on the books. So we don't need to do that. But we have to understand the perspectives of everyone in the room, everyone who's a decision maker, because everybody has a legitimate point of view and a legitimate corner on the truth. And until that's acknowledged, the discussion will not advance. People have diverse fiduciary concerns, and that's something I learned through the course of a 10-year process. This was a 10-year process to bring the CTSA from first conversation at the business meeting in 2013 to divestment in 2023. So what are the fiduciary commitments or interpretations of the people who have been charged with that work? What are the ways in which they are authorized to take input from others? What are the ways that others have the not only the right, but the mandate to speak up when there's a moral consideration that needs to be taken into account in those monetary fiscal investment plans? Another thing that's really important, and I think that climate advocates sometimes can miss this because of the depths of their passion, is that there are, let's call it alternate literacies. It's a big, complicated world out there. There's a lot to know and to understand. I'm a theologian. Dan is an ethicist. There are people out there who are soil scientists. There are people out there who are arborists. There are people out there who are none of the above, who are investment specialists, who are artists, who are auto mechanics. So we all have different funds of knowledge, and understanding the climate crisis may not be one of them. And that's perfectly legitimate as a starting point. But the catch here, and this is especially true, I think, in Catholic institutions where for most moral formation took place before Laudato Si, took place before, let's say, the papal document Dan referred to, the 1990 World Day of Peace message came out. That moral formation occurred before climate change was a pressing topic and was not inculcated within that moral formation. So people are obliged to not let that limit them, and everyone is obliged to move beyond whatever their alternate literacies are, because we are facing climate change in the face and we really can't run from it now or pretend we don't see it. So that's process, being diplomatic, understanding the process, knowing what the steps are, and engaging in synodal listening to understand the perspectives of people. And then we have to be persistent, because there are people who are committed to the current structures and to the current ways things are done and are very concerned. And when money comes into play, people are concerned about losing it. And I'm not going to enter into the conversation right now about the evidence for relative rates of return for fossil invested portfolios and divested invested portfolios. That's for another conversation and for another set of experts. I have heard those conversations, I will say that. But it pains me to say this. There's a need for persistence, because sometimes there are players who wish to maintain a status quo and use the power that they have. So we have to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, knowing that we're all looking for the best outcome, but without clarity on what's needed to transform our energy systems, people can lose sight of the imperative to do this. So it's good to use moderate language but to be insistent on one's moral clarity. In the case of the CTSA, this was a process of cyclical committees. Committees were assigned to do research, to write reports, to present these reports, to have the board members vote on them, to ask for new updates. There were changes as board members came in and out of leadership. COVID slowed us down a bit. We had some unusual interventions in the process by some variations in persons who joined the committee. So all of this meant a great deal of persistence was needed. I'll point out a couple interesting learnings. One, procedurally, at one point, the president of the CTSA requested a committee to research the impact of shareholder engagement. And I'm assuming everyone on this conversation understands shareholder engagement, but I'll just briefly say this is when a shareholder, someone who owns a portion of a company, has the capability of presenting a resolution, say, we feel a climate scientist should be on the board. And then that resolution, if it gets enough preliminary votes, is brought to the annual meeting and everybody votes on it. They've never passed. Not a single shareholder resolution of this type has passed. Maybe, Brian, Dan, correct me. Did Exxon get a vote passed to put a climate scientist on their board? They may have, but I don't think they did, because they are not obligated to do whatever the shareholder resolution asks them to do.
Correct.
So,
that's my understanding. It was non-binding.
These are non-binding resolutions. So that brings up another point. Why invest time and energy in a non-binding resolution? Time and energy are really limited. We need to spend them on transformative activities, things that matter and make a difference, not on empty symbols, straw symbols. So one of the learnings I had, however, was that the Catholic community as a whole has a very, very great commitment to this concept of shareholder engagement. And I think it's for good reason. We have a beautiful, deep, special, and highly intellectual tradition of Catholic social teaching, of which I personally am very proud. That's why I put up the picture of my great-great aunt. It's sort of symbolic of the whole communion of saints and our spiritual, ethical, theological traditions that I'm proud to be a part of. So if it's perceived that voting in accordance with Catholic social tradition in the public square of the boardroom is a way to lift up our Catholic values, I can see why that sounds great. Let's be witnesses. Let's bring our values into the boardroom. Let's show what Catholic social teaching means. And here's the twist. I think that when Catholic social teaching is talking about process, it can be very transformational. If we're talking about the process of manufacturing things in a way that's safe for workers, that involves fewer toxins, that promotes women, that is more inclusive of BIPOC communities, that reduces child labor, these are resolutions that affect the process to make a product, and I think they can have a lot of effect. And we've seen that. And so that's a good thing. When the goal of the shareholder engagement or the shareholder resolution is to eliminate the product, please stop making your fossil fuel products. That's never going to be passed. that invites the company to put itself out of business. So shareholder engagement might work on process-related resolutions. It's illogical and self-destructive to the company for it to work in a fossil fuel product scenario. And that's what we've seen. 45 years of shareholder engagement have resulted in zero transformative resolutions and no reduction of emissions. To the contrary, emissions are going up. So shareholder engagement is not a tool that works. And we are called to use our time, our energy, our smarts, and the power of our institutions as moral witnesses prudently, efficiently, to good end. So my view is, if you really, really, really want to do shareholder engagement for fossil fuels, well, I think you need to justify the time that it takes. I haven't seen justification for it, but you may. But I think that examine, if we want to use that word, that examine to see, is that a useful use of time is necessary, because we can't just squander our staff time on these activities. However, having learned that there is such a dedication to this process, maybe because people have found it hard to tease out, well, it's great for, ending child labor, but not so much for fossil fuels. Tease that out, and then maybe we can see that better. But until that happens, I came to the opinion as an advocate that, okay, we just have to compromise. Go ahead. Use $2,000 of your holdings in order to have the privilege of advocating for divestment and advocating for resolutions, divest the rest. I fell into a compromise position because I think it's necessary. The other thing that I did theologically is argue for a sacramental view of divestment, that when we use our funds in order to build up renewable, clean, healthy energy, that is a gift of life. That is a real symbol of love for the neighbor. In the Rodnerian sense, it is a real symbol. It is making that love present and visible in the reality of clean energy. So I think this is a very deep way of interpreting our discipleship. And I will just leave it with that and say that persistence is needed, prayer is needed, diplomacy is needed, but also at times the strength and the clarity to say, wait a minute, we can do things differently. And what's really holding us back? So I salute everyone out there who is leading a discernment process. And I encourage you in a gentle path of synodal listening to stretch yourself as much as possible to understand all the perspectives in the room so that we can go forward together.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, it was a learning experience for both of us and for a lot of our colleagues to finally bring CTSA to the place of divestment. So we've had the national experience in the context of a professional organization. But as Brian said, I'm a moral theologian here at Creighton University, and Creighton University has made the decision to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. And in talking about all of this with folks across the country, the question that I inevitably get is, how did that happen? And so what I want to do is walk through really the process by which Creighton students were ultimately able to secure fossil fuel divestment. And as Erin said, it was a process. I want to frame this with a quote that I love using in one of my classes with students on faith-based organizing that comes from two sociologists. Students learn that these events happened. but they do not learn how people made them happen. Social change in America is usually explained in quite sanitized ways. And I used this quote for several years, but it became especially salient to me a couple of years ago when our then second grader brought home some artwork from school, having celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And he had colored a picture that was not dissimilar from this. And he told me about what they learned. And I said, well, how did Dr. King do this? How did he help people to be recognized and affirmed in their equal dignity? And he said, well, he gave a speech and people were treated better. And I said, well, that's maybe part of how the process occurred. But as I am working with my students right now, they're learning that that's not all that happened. That in fact, Dr. King was arrested multiple times for the work that he did to ultimately secure social change. So I think this is important to frame that these things don't just happen, people make them happen. People make them happen in the social sciences using call a theory of change, my undergraduate. And when we talk about a theory of change, this is a scientific method by which some outcome is achieved. And in his letter from Birmingham City Jail, Dr. King identifies the 4 dimensions of the civil rights movement theory of change. So he writes that in any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps. Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, so you have to demonstrate the problem. Negotiation, which today I think we would usually call advocacy, but you've got to ask nicely, you've got to ask diplomatically, you've got to make your case. But if and when asking nicely doesn't work, Dr. King said the third move is into what he called self-purification. In the Ignatian tradition, we might call discernment. But it's beginning to ask what other strategies are available and am I willing to go through with them? Am I willing to possibly sacrifice and pay some personal cost in order to contribute to some greater good? So self-purification is the discernment that ultimately then might lead to direct action, nonviolent direct action in the form of marches, boycotts, sit-ins, all the things that have helped secure social change across the 20th century and 21st century, especially in the United States. So Dr. King gives us a theory of change. And when we talk about community organizing, one of really the seminal figures in the United States is Saul Alinsky, who worked in Chicago, actually with then one of the auxiliary archbishops in Chicago, really building a coalition that included Catholics, meatpacking workers, people from all kinds of labor organizations, to advocate for better working conditions in back of the yards and the meatpacking plants. And one of the principles that Alinsky developed or really identified is to make the audience live up to their own book of rules. And I think this is really what Creighton students did in terms of mission and identity. And I think it's interesting that our event tonight is co-sponsored by Gonzaga's Office for Mission Ministry Integration, that students were very intentional about framing their ask using the university's own stated values, mission, and identity. You say this is who you are. You say this is your mission statement. You say that Catholic social teaching requires this and this. You say the Ignatian tradition requires this, but we're not doing that. And theologically, that's what we would talk about as prophetic witness. The prophets were the ones across the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament who essentially did 3 things. And this is from theologian Kathy Caveney. But prophets name the standard, they name the gap, so they point out the ways that a community is not living up to that standard, and then they call for conversion. That's what prophets do. Name the standard, name the gap, call for conversion. And so when we think about divestment, it really is in many ways a matter of institutional accountability, and also fidelity. Fidelity is faithfulness as an adequate response to its own stated values, mission, and identity. So this is a little bit of social science context. What I want to do now is really have some of the students explain in their own words how they secured divestment here at Creighton. So this is from the former CSU, so Creighton Student Union President Donna Shabazi. So Donna was CSU president when divestment was being pursued and when it was ultimately secured. And she went on to a master's degree at Seattle University. And I'm going to pull from a final paper that she did as part of a fellowship in Seattle's Office for Sustainability. So she writes, during the summer of 2019, 5 student leaders began drafting the original official legislation that would go to a student body vote and become CSU referendum number 1902. So in terms of King's theory of change, students began with negotiation. They began, as Erin said, with knowing the process, and incrementally, in terms of Catholic social teaching, subsidiarity, starting with the lowest possible level, they began with their own student government. And so they put together over the course of months and months and months what eventually became an 11-page student referendum calling the university to divest from the Underground 200, the Carbon Underground 200, so the largest 200 corporations with the largest fossil fuel holdings. I've given you screenshots of just the first 3 pages of this, but you can see the abstract leading into the actual text of the resolution. But you can see here, right in this first page on the abstract, it applies Creighton's own mission statement, strategic plan, and investment policy to encourage divestment, right? So they're holding the university to its own standards, in the words of Alinsky. So they began working on this text in the summer of 19, and the 5 student authors of the referendum became the core leaders of the Creighton climate movement, setting meeting times, locations, organizing volunteers within the movement, being the face and voice of the movement, and keeping volunteers informed. And this really operationalized the social science that, as Gallagher et al. Describe, you need organizers. Again, change doesn't just happen. People make it happen, and they make it happen through strategic, persistent, organized efforts to build cohorts and bring together disparate groups. So the authors here write, you need someone keeping volunteers engaged and on track, providing updates and jobs that need to be done. You need someone to encourage activists to stretch outside their comfort zones. You need someone to consistently close the loop, letting volunteers know the results and value of their actions and the results of each tactic attempted. This is an organizer. So students were organizers in lots of different ways, but the way that they really coalesced in terms of a pointed organizing campaign is that nearly all fall was spent educating the student body, recruiting other members for the movement, and ensuring that students across all 9 schools and colleges, so Creighton has 9 schools and colleges, as well as Creighton satellite campuses, were aware of the vote. So as Erin said, they didn't just call for a vote. They spent months and months on outreach and education, helping people understand what is divestment, why are we calling for it, how is it aligned with our movement. And this included attending every student organization meeting to share CCM story, tabling on campus, and the greatest asset, filming an informational video. And I want to switch screens now and share this video. So this is what the students put together ahead of the November vote. So the CSU resolution was on the docket throughout the fall, and it was voted on in November. And so all fall students had produced this video over the summer, and all fall they distributed it across campuses. So they asked faculty to show it at the beginning of classes. They put it on their own social media accounts. So they saturated the student body with essentially an education campaign. What is this and how is it happening? You'll notice this little asterisk here, Creighton University fossil fuel divestment. That had to be amended after the university's general counsel sent a cease and desist letter to the 5 students organizing all of this, threatening legal action if they continued to pursue divestment using the university's name. So they had to make some changes on the fly. So, but this is the video that they put together and as I said, really disseminated all fall long.
Divestment is pulling investment out of any stocks, bonds, or other investments that are unethical or immoral,
and reinvesting in more economically, socially, and environmentally responsible options.
By voting yes on referendum 1902, we're asking Creighton to divest its endowment from fossil fuel companies that drive the global climate crisis.
But what's an endowment?
An endowment is all of the finances an institution has, which are used for the functionality of the university and for investing to make more money for the university.
Creighton's endowment is around $568 million. And 10.6% of that is invested in fossil fuel companies.
That's over $60 million.
By voting yes on referendum number 1902,
we're asking Creighton to divest from the top 200 highest emitting fossil fuel companies by 2025.
That's about 2% of the endowment.
After that, we asked Creighton to divest completely from fossil fuel companies by the time the university achieves its goal of reaching full carbon neutrality in operations.
In other words, if we're not using fossil fuels, we should not invest in fossil fuels.
Creighton should divest from fossil fuels because the investment in fossil fuels poses a constant risk to the school's financial security, as over the long term, the value of our investments in these companies will decrease.
Government regulations on carbon emissions tighten. Fossil fuels become more expensive to extract, and renewables become less expensive. Remaining invested poses a greater and greater threat to Creighton's financial stability.
By divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in other sectors, Creighton will have the opportunity to avoid these risks while maximizing returns.
Divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in less risky, more ethical industries will ensure Creighton's ability to support students with scholarships from now into the future.
Seattle University, Syracuse University, and Oregon State University, as well as many other institutions, cities, and countries, have already taken a stand and divested. And their examples show that it is possible to divest and that it can be done without sacrificing returns.
Divestment is a proven strategy for creating social change. Divestment in South African companies helped lead to the end of apartheid in South Africa.
Remaining investing at such high percentage in the fossil fuel industry is financially irresponsible, and it's time for Creighton to divest.
Creighton must divest, because according to Nature, 1/3 of oil reserves, 50% of gas reserves, and over 80% of coal reserves must remain untapped in order to prevent catastrophic warming. But fossil fuel companies depend on this extraction and the use of these reserves.
Warming of even 1.5 degrees Celsius is correlated with higher levels of poverty, hunger, sea level rise, and more intense natural disasters. And these impacts will disproportionately fall on our poorest and most vulnerable communities throughout the world.
By investing our endowment in fossil fuels, we are investing in an industry whose long-term success is inseparable from the creation of a planet that is inhospitable for human life.
By investing in fossil fuels, we are investing in a scientific, economic, and moral catastrophe.
As Pope Francis said in his most recent season of creation, now is the time to abandon our dependence on fossil fuels and move quickly and decisively towards forms of clean energy and a sustainable and circular economy.
Creighton must divest so we can be men and women born with others by refusing to profit off companies that passively and actively harm the poorest and most vulnerable in our society.
Creighton must divest to be a leader in moving our campus, our community, and our world forward to a better tomorrow.
Creighton must divest to fulfill its mission to work for the betterment of society.
Creighton must divest to promote ecological justice on its campus, within Omaha, and within society at large.
Creighton must divest to show value and respect for all of creation by acting as good stewards of our environment.
Creighton must divest in order to align with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops' socially responsible guidelines, which emphasize the protection of the environment when deciding how funds should be invested. Creighton currently follows all of these guidelines except for the protection of the environment.
Creighton must divest to ensure that our education is funded by the fruits of just investments, not by profits inseparably tied to the suffering of all people impacted by the climate crisis.
Creighton must divest to secure a hospitable planet and a bright future for its students, the youth of today, and generations to come.
Creighton must divest from fossil fuels because we cannot go set the world on fire if it's already burning.
That was the video that students shared for really months across the fall semester. And so they did their research. They obviously tried to integrate mission. They integrated science. They brought in economics. And so the vote was held in November. And you can see here from media accounts, both local and national, The vote passed with 86% of students who voted supporting referendum 1902, asking the university to divest. So 2,093 students voted in favor of divestment. This was the largest single turnout for a referendum vote in the history of CSU. So they had built their base, they had turned people out, and they had put a marker on the table. This is what students wanted. You'll notice that the students had media, both local and national. Again, this didn't just happen. Students made it happen. Part of their strategic organizing plan was to bring in communications. And so they reached out to local reporters, they reached out to national reporters because they recognized that the university's reputation in many ways was on the line in terms of both fidelity and credibility. And they saw that as one of their resources that they could use to try and catalyze change. So the university rejected the student referendum in November of 2019. Subsequently, in February of 2020, the university made some incremental progress and was willing to divest down from 8.9% of its endowment down to 5.7% of its endowment in fossil fuel corporations. So there was some material change, there was some movement, but it didn't meet the standards that were voted on overwhelmingly in the CSU referendum. And so again, following Dr. King's theory of change, if and when negotiation fails and advocacy doesn't work and asking nicely doesn't catalyze change, the process then moves through discernment into the prospect of nonviolent direct action. So when the resolution failed, students began the process of discernment and ultimately elected to engage in nonviolent direct action. The action that they planned was, as you can see here, cleverly titled Ad Majorem Petroleum Gloriam, March to the Boardroom. So a play on the Jesuit motto, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, to the greater glory of God. And so what I want to do now is show a video of what this march entailed. It was from the steps of St. John's Church, which is the parish on Creighton's campus, down to the Board of Trustees room in our Harper Center, which is home to the business school. And they timed this to be held on a day when the Board of Trustees was actually meeting. Creighton has two campuses. We have a full four-year medical campus in Phoenix. And so the trustees were actually meeting in Phoenix. And so it was somewhat symbolic because the trustees weren't there, but obviously they were aware of what was happening in Omaha. You're going to see some students holding these little cards, and I wanted to give a zoomed in picture. This is the concluding prayer of Laudato Si from Pope Francis that reads, "Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live." So as they marched, students held these cards and they used this prayer to pray out loud by name for each member of the Board of Trustees, because they ultimately held the power as to whether Creighton would fully divest. And so this was, as I said, held on February 20th. And so I'll show the video and then lead to the conclusion about how this all played out.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Burke. I'm a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences and a member of the climate movement. To begin our event today, I would first like to acknowledge and appreciate the context we find ourselves in. As I look into the crowd standing in front of me, I'm inspired to see students and faculty alike standing in solidarity with each other and with the institution to which we all belong. Creighton and its Catholic Jesuit identity lends itself to the promotion of justice and the building up of the common good. That much we all know. But in a time defined by injustice and a generation defined by runaway climate change, where do we find ourselves? Where do we find this institution? Creighton's Board of Trustees, entrusted as stewards of our mission, are meeting in Phoenix tomorrow. By marching today, we demonstrate the broad support for divestment and fidelity to the mission of our university. We demonstrate the urgent plea of our generation that those in power act in accordance with science and with morality. Now, no one here thinks that divestment will solve climate change. But we do think, and in fact we know, that divestment is an essential step since it frees capital for sustainable investment and stigmatizes fossil fuel corporations as complicit in the immorality of climate change. Divestment is a tactic, yes, but justice is the ultimate goal. In his 2015 encyclical on the environment, Pope Francis declares our society in need of an ecological conversion, a profound change in head and in heart. In the context of refusal by our university's administration and trustees to fully divest in accordance with CSU referendum number 1902, it is this that we pray for today.
I need not repeat the horrifying science of climate change. I need not explain our concern for the most vulnerable of our world. I need not remind us of the existential threat looming over our human family. Why? Because we all already understand. That's why we're here. Instead, we must pray for those who have yet to grasp the extent of these realities, but who hold the most power.
So that was students' response to rejection of the advocacy ask in referendum 1902. And so this, as with the resolution, got media coverage. So again, they were very intentional about making sure that fidelity and accountability were broadly used to frame what they were asking for. They were asking for alignment with the university's own mission. Subsequent to the march, so this was February of 20, on New Year's Eve, on December 31st of 2020, we got an email from university president that the university had in fact made the decision to fully divest from the Carbon Underground 200 within 10 years in accordance with referendum 1902. So again, more media coverage, again, bringing in the university's credibility, its reputation, all again as a way to apply the social sciences to realize really the Catholic social teaching in terms of what the church has always taught with respect to economic justice and the need to invest in accord with moral principles, as well as pursue climate justice in particular. So I'm very, very proud to be at Creighton. I'm very proud of all the work that the students did. I'm hoping that this is a kind of inspiration and a resource to others who are interested in following this work. And I'm looking forward to conversation. So with that, I will turn things back over to Brian.
How very inspirational. Thank you both so much. So everybody, let's join me in giving our speakers a round of applause. One of the dissatisfying things about Zoom is to not hear some raucous applause at the end of a well-delivered talk. If any of you have questions or comments, please go to the Q&A feature, open that box, and put in a question that you might have. And while you're thinking about your question, I would maybe start off. And I just wanted to pose a couple of things that I hear frequently and get your opinions on if you're interested. So one initial one is divestment isn't really possible because everything has fossil fuels in it. And you mentioned the Carbon Underground 200, but it's for people who aren't deep in this like you two are. Well, what is the top Carbon 200, Carbon Underground 200? How do you respond to somebody who says it's not possible to divest, everything has it, there's no purity possible, so why why fool ourselves into thinking divestment is possible. And I should probably throw that to someone, but to one of you. But either of you, feel free.
Erin, you addressed this so well with CTSA and folks bringing up similar questions, so I'll defer to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Dan. And, one thing I think more and more is that Jesus counseled us to avoid tithing mint and rue and obsessing over the small perfections of our lives, which we can't achieve in this fallen world. But what we can do is do the best we can. And so taking a stab at the biggest chunk of offenders, the carbon 200 is the largest way to draw a circle around the greatest offenders in terms of fossil production and say, I'm doing this. And it's morally escapist to look for perfection before we can achieve, before we allow ourselves to do something. Something I always say is the perfect is the enemy of the good. Perfect is not for us to achieve. So let us start with the activities we can. It is a good point that there's carbon in so many industries other than the fossil fuel and the power sector. So some say our goal should be decarbonizing, and I'm all for that. Let's make sure we don't forget about the carbon that's involved in producing steel, in our agriculture, in the ways we've failed to take the opportunities of electric vehicles, of electrified transport, et cetera, of simply efficiency and of waste in food. It's a crying shame. So there certainly are many ways to reduce carbon in all sorts of sectors besides just the power sector, but that's a critical one. And that's the chokehold that we need to cut off the easy flow of petroleum, and more so, the completely unnecessary, vicious, and demonic continued extraction and prospecting for more when the fossil fuel companies have all that they need on the books to take us far beyond a sustainable carbon budget. So we have to start somewhere.
Well said. And to clarify, the top 200 are the top 100 oil companies and the top 100 gas companies. That's the 200. Is that right?
I'll let Dan handle this definition.
So the carbon underground 200, essentially largest oil and gas, coal. It's measured by way of carbon reserves, and so the type of carbon is relatively irrelevant compared to the amount of carbon stored in reserve. So whether it's an oil company, whether it's a coal company, the type of carbon is relatively immaterial on the way that carbon is used. If it's a carbon intensive a company that's involved in a carbon intensive process, they would be included in it. So because this is all benchmarked against our carbon budget, we only have X tons of carbon and carbon equivalent that we can emit in order to stay below 1.5 C. So we're going to target the 200 largest companies with reserves that would essentially exhaust that carbon budget.
Thanks for clarifying that. I think it's a useful way of approaching it because the goal is to keep that carbon in the ground, and so you target those who own the carbon that's in the ground rather than those who are using it for other uses. You're saying let's not invest in those people who are trying to remove it from the ground in the first place. Dan, the question from Lena says the response of Boston College's current administration in regards to divestment is that, quote, the endowment exists to provide a permanent source of funding for financial aid, faculty chairs, student programs, and scholarships, as well as the university's academic and research initiatives, and it's not a tool to promote social or political change, however desirable that change might be. And they go on to say, I find this to be antithetical to Catholic social teaching, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that statement.
Yeah, so I can take this one. So I'm a double eagle. So I did my master's at Boston College, and then also did my PhD there as well. So I'm very familiar, Liam, with the dynamics of the divestment movement at BC. I think I'll try and respond in a couple of different ways. One from the perspective of ethics generally, and then one from Catholic social teaching that you described more specifically. In philosophical ethics, and certainly in Catholic theological ethics as well, but in philosophical ethics, a kind of core principle of utilitarianism is the ends justify the means. That so long as the end is desirable, we can achieve it by literally any means necessary. There is no what we might talk about as an intrinsic evil. There's nothing that's prohibited so long as it realizes some greater good. There's certainly a role for utilitarianism in work for justice. We live in a finite world and we can't do everything. So when we try and do the greatest good for the greatest number, there's some measure of utilitarianism in thinking about a budget, for example. We can't do everything for everybody. But the Catholic tradition is clear that the concept of ends always justifying the means is unacceptable and immoral and unethical. So we have the concept in the Catholic tradition of intrinsic evil. There are certain actions that cannot be justified, no matter how good the outcomes that they may generate might be. So it's a very utilitarian instrumental argument that even philosophically has been challenged. Moving again, then more specifically into the Catholic tradition, this response that you described is actually antithetical not only to Catholic social teaching generally, but also the U.S. Catholic bishops' own teaching, and particularly with respect to investments. So you heard one of the students in the video describe the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' socially responsible investment guidelines, precisely because the Catholic tradition says the ends can't always justify the means. The U.S. bishops for decades, this is now in I believe its sixth edition, going back decades, has affirmed that there have to be moral principles that govern how both individuals and organizations invest their money. You cannot justify investing in companies that are performing intrinsic evils, no matter how great the rate of return and no matter how many wonderful things you might be with the profit that's generated from those investments. In philosophy, the logical fallacy is reductio ad absurdum. That's also relevant to this conversation in the sense that reductio ad absurdum says you take the basic logic of the argument and you run it to its logical conclusion. Based on what you've written in your question, the logical conclusion is Boston College would invest in literally anything, so long as it yielded the highest rate of return in order to justify the ends of all the things that you were described. I can think of some companies off the top of my head that, if suggested as investments for Boston College, the university would have a moral problem with and take an ethical stand against, no matter the rate of return. So I don't think you can apply the logic that underpins the basic reasoning that you've described and apply it across the board, which is to say, there are some moral principles that have to be incorporated into the ethics of the discernment of investments. And as the Catholic tradition has reiterated again and again and again, divestment for the sake of promoting the common good and climate solvency is good that ought to be included in the moral discernment of ethical investing. So all of that's to say, I appreciate the question. I'm very familiar with the argument. And I think in terms of both philosophy and theology, it is morally bankrupt.
Erin, did you want to add anything before we move on to another question?
Sure. I echo what Dan has said, that the logic of using a university's endowment in order to advance mission, to gain the highest returns for mission, is easily undermined by the fact that the bishop's socially responsible investment guidelines have screens that forbid investment in certain sectors no matter what the profit is. So maximization of profit is excluded as a process by the bishop's guidelines and, of course, by Laudato Si. It's stated clearly in the bishop's guidelines. I have reflected on the church's investment and profit from oil leasing in an article that was just posted to the chat. So I invite you all to take a look at that. This article attempts to look at some of the decision-making steps that might be considered assessing the morality of a church or, say, a diocese owning mineral rights, oil, profiting from oil leases, and for the argument that this could raise a lot of money for their mission. So your opinion is requested in this article. There's a reader survey as part of it. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you in the chat.
Thank you. Everybody can take a look at that. I think I posted it to everybody there in the chat. Another common argument I hear is that divestment is really just symbolic. And I mean this in the sense that therefore not worth doing. What do you think would be the, is it just symbolic, and is it therefore not worth doing?
What a great question. What a great question for a group of Catholics. What is our faith? Symbols are so meaningful, so powerful in the representation of our faith. They are not hollow. They are not empty. That's why I turn to a Rahnerian interpretation of the real symbol. The symbol of the Eucharist is God's presence within us. Is that an empty symbol? No, it is a real symbol. It is God's presence among us. The gift of our funds for clean, renewable, healthy, life-giving energy. It's not an empty symbol. It is a real gift of that which supports life. And today, life needs energy. And as Pope Francis said, civilization requires energy, but energy should not destroy civilization. So there's nothing empty or hollow about symbols. They're very real. And additionally, on the level where they do operate slightly more symbolically, they're just as powerful there for the way a moral statement can challenge a culture, can invite the culture to rethink what is true, what is good, what is holy, and to say, wait a minute, the church, this institution is no longer investing. Why is that? What's underneath it? It's powerfully instructive and a powerful witness. Furthermore, it's pragmatic. The funds that are now going into further expansion of our oil fields, that's buying more oil. That's buying more oranges. Instead, we need to shift those funds to renewable energy so that we scale up renewable energy by unthinkable scale. That's that graph that I looked at in the first place. Those green bars were not good enough. Those were 70% green bars. We need 100% green bars. So we need every dollar to be reinvested in renewable energy. The money is currently going into dirty, destructive fossil fuel energy, and there are subsidies that further empower the fossil fuel industry to make as much money as possible at the least cost to themselves, with the extra funding for royalties, with deductions for new equipment, with deductions for fees they may have paid for oil spills. I mean, the subsidies are enormous and well documented.
The other thing that I would say to that is, just to follow up, because I think it's important to think about effectiveness, and research has shown that divestment is effective in terms of impacting companies, in terms of them being willing to lay out R&D capital to explore new reserves. So I mean, it is impactful, but I think the Jesuit John Coleman several years ago was asked about climate change and whether we're effective. And I'll never forget the answer he gave. And he essentially paraphrased Dorothy Day, but he said, ultimately, as Catholics, as Christians, the most important question isn't, were we effective? The most important question is, were we faithful? Were we faithful? Did we, as we talked about earlier with the catechism, did we respond adequately? Did we respond prudently to the best information that we had available to us? Whether it was effective is certainly important, but efficacy is secondary to fidelity. So the most important question to me is, are we being faithful?
And I'd like to refine that a little bit. Sorry, Brian, I cut you off.
Go ahead.
To Dan's excellent point, we are called to be faithful and hopeful, not necessarily effective, but we are called to do our work and live out our faith indeed, with the greatest prudence. And so it's interesting to me more and more to ponder how effective, how prudent, how synodal even, how invitational is this word divest. And I think that it can play into the polarizing we have, and in some cases stop the conversation before it's begun. And that's a risk. And I think that we want to build bridges among all communities in our church. And so finding ways to have language that is moral, clear, committed, but also invitational, where we're extending an evangelical call. So I don't know what that is yet. Maybe it's decarbonize, which has the advantage of being comprehensive and looking at the airline industry, the cement industry, the agriculture industry, et cetera. There's something very clear about divestment, but again, I think we're learning how we help this process move along.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation, and I'm glad that folks from around the world have been able to join us, and we'll be watching it online on our YouTube channel. One of the things I've found here at Gonzaga is we have an administration that has very sincere in its desire to not take stands which are not meaningful and genuine, and if in part hesitated to pursue divestment, in part because they want to make sure it wouldn't just be greenwashing, it wouldn't just be a hollow gesture. And I think we have a real opportunity after 11 years now to continue the conversation where, as you were saying, Erin, we can have thoughtful conversations about exactly what would divestment or more consistent investment of our resources in ways that aren't looking to profit from the creation of the very crisis that is disrupting the habitability of our planet and endangering some of the most vulnerable members of our community. And deciding on a listening process that would commit to figuring it out. And that's my hope personally, is that the students and the university can come together and commit to figuring out what would it look like to have an ESG policy for our endowment that would be meaningful where fossil fuels are concerned. And I have a lot of hope that with goodwill on both sides, that's still possible. How many months or years we have in front of us is unclear, but having examples such as Creighton is really useful. And these are complicated interesting issues, but having it's front and center that these are mission issues. This is an expression of our identity as a Jesuit Catholic institution is really, really important. So I thank you both for sharing your theological background. It's really useful in helping us to understand another part of our mission. So thank you all for being here, and hope to see you at one of our events again soon.